Prayer. Prayer is key to spirituality and worship. Anyone who considers themselves spiritually inclined would know this. But as an activity or as a practice, it gets sometimes confusing and can get really complicated too quickly. Today, I want us to inhabit a poem that reminds us what we do when we pray. It's a poem by George Herbert, a 17th century English poet, and it's titled Prayer. Prayer, the church's banquet, angel's age, God's breath in man returning to his birth, the soul in paraphrase, art in pilgrimage, the Christian plummet sounding heaven and earth, engine against the almighty sinner's tower, reverse thunder, Christ's side piercing spear, the 6 days world transposing into an hour, a kind of tune, which all things hear and fear, softness and peace and joy and love and bliss, exalted manner, gladness of the best, heaven in ordinary man well dressed, the Milky Way, the bird of paradise, church bells beyond the stars heard, the soul's blood, the land of spices, something understood. It's a very short poem. It meanders a lot, but it does that for a reason, and that reason is key to what we do when we pray. As you can see, the poet here, George Herbert, is talking about so many different things: angels, humanity, birds, lands of spices, joy, sorrow, sadness, all kinds of things. What is going on and what is that thing? As I was saying to a friend recently, I had to ask myself, what are we doing when we pray? And I had to remind and refresh my memory about it, that prayer is about bringing ourselves, the whole of our lives before God and saying, this is who I am, presenting it to God. And that's what prayer is, and that's what this poem reminds us. All aspects of our lives should be brought to God. Sometimes we reduce prayer to just making requests, but that's not just what prayer is. Prayer is a key part of worship, like I've said, and it should be about every aspect of our lives. Maybe we call it praise sometimes, and yes, it is, but we can also call it prayer when we bring the happy parts to God and we bring the sad parts to God. It should be prayer. And the sad part, when we bring it to God, we often call it lament. Now, in our day, we don't practice lament a lot, but it's biblical. Romans 8 itself shows that we should be lamenting, because it talks about the groaning of creation, the groaning of we humans that are, filled with the Spirit of God, and even the groaning of the Spirit of God Himself. And we'll come back to that. But there is that aspect of prayer that is lament, just as there's the aspect of prayer that is praise, the good side, the fun side, the excited part of prayer. But then there's the sad part, the mournful part. And there's prayer that talks about us, or prayer that extends beyond us to the rest of the world. Prayer is bringing our whole life and everything about us before God and saying, this is who I am, this is what I am. I'm giving it all to you. That's what prayer is. And it is the beginning of vocations as humans, to be the image of God. Sometimes when we read Genesis 1 and it tells us to have dominion and all of that, we often see ourselves, dashing into the world and creating stuff and, dominating creation. But as I've said on this channel, that's not really the picture. If you need to go to Genesis 2 and remind yourself that it's actually a service, because Genesis 2 paints a slightly different picture, same picture as Genesis 1, but it makes the point much clearer, so we don't get confused with what we might think when we read Genesis 1. It puts us in a garden and it says to keep and guard the garden. That's our vocation through all of creation. But that vocation begins in the place of prayer. You begin to exercise your stewardship over creation in the place of prayer. That's what prayer is. It's we humans bringing everything about us, our lives, bringing it before God. And not just the good parts, like I've said, but also the bad part, also the sorrowful part, also the sad part, also the fun part. That's what prayer is. And if your prayer doesn't include that, maybe you need to step up your spirituality. If you still think there are parts of you or parts of your life that you cannot bring to God, you cannot say to God, I wonder what you think you're doing, because God sees it all anyway. And at this point, I want to talk about the book of Psalms, because Psalms are basically poems that can be sung. They are poems that are basically prayers and can be sung. And if you go through the Psalms, you see all the different kinds, the positive kind, like the very first Psalm, Psalm 1, and everything going good for the human. And you go to Psalm 2, and trouble is already beginning. And you go to Psalm 3, and the trouble has gotten worse. And by the time you get to Psalms like Psalm 44, it's mourning and saying, God, why have you rejected us? And you get to Psalm 88 that even gets a little worse. It ends on a dark note, not even on the way most Psalms end, on a positive note. So if you have just been bringing the good parts of your life to God, or just been making your request to God, maybe you haven't been doing this spirituality or worship very well. Worship and true spirituality, prayer should bring all of your life, everything about you should put it before God and say, this is who I am. This is what I am. Your request could be, change me. I don't know what I'm going to do about this. Change me. Like Psalm 51. David says, create in me a new heart and give me a free spirit. Sustain me with a free spirit. That's what prayer is. That's what prayer is. And just to add one more point, also, I would encourage you not only to open up all of yourselves to God in prayer because you need to, but also allow God help you say it the way it needs to be said. I referenced Romans 8, the last earlier, and I want to call our attention to that. That if you let me read two lines in this poem again, and then make that point. In the second line, the poet says, God's breath in man returning to his birth. What's going on there? But before I explain, let me read the last line. The land of spices, something understood. As I read those two lines, I think the poet has Romans 8 in mind, where Paul says that we don't know how to pray, but the Spirit is praying for us, and the Father, the one who searches the heart, understands what the Spirit is saying. Said that. I want you to think about that again. God's breath in man returning to his birth. The land of spices, something understood. So as you open up yourself in prayer and stop hiding those parts of you, those parts of your life, even the bad parts, as you learn to bring that before God and say, this is who and what I am. Can you do something about it? Please do something about it. Also learn to allow the Spirit of God give you the right words to express that. And many times in the place of prayer, they can get very poetic. And I hope you learn to do that from today onwards. God bless.